Hey there, everybody. My name is Leilani. Thank you guys for stopping by my channel, The Magical Solution. I'm really excited tonight. I know that I say this every Sunday when I have a guest, but I'm really excited tonight because we have Dr. Megan Rose joining us tonight. And she wrote this amazing book called Spirit Marriage, Intimate Relationships with Otherworldly Beings. And I'll be posting the links to purchase that book in the chat down below. And this conversation, I feel, is the right conversation to be having right now. A lot of people are talking about it. A lot of people have feelings and have thoughts and have opinions and all that stuff. So why don't we just talk to some experts about it? I think that's just the best way to handle this, right? So we're going to do that tonight with Dr. Megan Rose. She has a doctorate in East-West psychology from the California Institute of Integral Studies and a master's degree in religion and society from the Graduate Theological Union. She is an initiated ceremonial magician, a Shakta Tantric practitioner, and a senior seer in the House of Brigh Faery Seership Institute. She serves as an ordained interfaith minister and psycho-spiritual counselor and is the executive director of the Entheosis Institute. So without further ado, let's bring her on. Hey there!
Woo!
Miss Dr. Rose, I just want to say thank you so much for popping on my show tonight. When I saw your book come through the magazine of Inner Traditions, I said, I have to read that. And then when I'm done reading it, I have to speak to the author. And when you said yes, I was just so excited. So thank you.
You're welcome. It's a pleasure to be here.
So let's get into it. Let's jump right in because there's so much stuff. This is such a juicy book, and you guys check it out. It's also kind of thick. It's a juicy book, lots of juicy topics. So to give everyone sort of like a quick little synapse, Dr. Rose goes on basically a field trip around the world to talk and interview various, practitioners, initiates, and people of varying cultures who practice spirit marriage, and to get their opinions, to get their ideas, to get their experiences firsthand. And we're talking like traditions from all over the place. Great book. But for someone who's never picked it up before, has heard the buzzword of God spousing and spirit marriage just kind of floating around the internet, how would you define what God spousing and spirit marriage is? Like, what is that?
Yeah. So I use the term spirit, right, as a sort of umbrella term to really refer to any non-corporeal or non-human being, an entity. And that it can encompass anything from deities to angels to elementals to beloved dead, right, ancestors. So it's this very large category. And I just use the term spirit because that sort of is the closest thing that gets us to the idea that it's not physically incarnate. Although there are ways in which these beings actually work and move through physical things. We can talk more about that later. But so that's the spirit part. And then the marriage part, again, is like, it's the best term. It's the closest term that folks sort of understand is a bonded, committed relationship between a human and a one of these spirit type beings, because we understand generally what a marriage is, right? And marriages meant many different things culturally throughout history, and spirit marriages are very different, from culture to culture, tradition to tradition, person to person even. So the way that you, the relationships agreements that you might have with your human partner is as unique as the two of you, right? Everybody's relationship would be different. So everybody's spirit marriage looks slightly different as well. So some of the other terms that are also used that convey spirit marriages, as you mentioned, God spousing. I tend to shy away from God spousing because that it's a gendered term, and it's a very specific form of a spirit, right? A deity.
Right.
And that is not as inclusive as some of these other, terms. So indwelling is another term, which is like also a merge is another term that is used in other cultures, and a symbiosis is sort of a third or fourth term that defines sort of the mechanics of what's going on here. And the idea is that a human steps into this bonded, committed relationship with an otherworldly being. And that relationship is unlike, mediumship or channeling or having a spirit guide or a tutelary spirit or a familiar spirit. This, I like to say, is maybe a little more of an advanced practice in that you've sort of dated around, you've maybe had a familiar spirit, and you've maybe had some of these other experiences, and then the decision to commit, right? The decision to go deep with one or a set of spirits is usually presented to you. So it's often sort of an invitation that comes at the behest of the spirit, inviting the individual to marry them. And depending on the culture that you're in and the practices that you're working with, that can look a lot of different ways. But again, I really focused my research on people who've gone through some sort of a ritual or ceremony bonding them to a spirit. And I interviewed like 9 different practitioners in 7 different traditions. And a large majority of those traditions actually have a bonding ceremony with like a cake. Well, I mean, not necessarily a cake, but like a community, and wedding rings and vows are exchanged, and it's a whole fete. It's a
The whole thing.
yeah, the whole.
Yeah. So I'm glad you said that. I'm glad that you said it was that normally you would see it as being proposed by the spirit, because I was kind of curious as to like who makes the first move on this one, you know what I mean? So I like that you mentioned that. Also, is spirit marriage like an initiation? Like what's the purpose of a spirit marriage? Like why would anyone want to engage in that
Yeah, so folklorically and historically, it is often the spirit that comes and says, I want to marry you. But that is not the only instance of this. And they either come to you or they will come to an elder or a mentor in your tradition and say, I want to marry so and so. And then you have, the option of saying yes or no, because we always, want to know that we have agency in these decisions. But usually it's because there's some sort of a co-creative project or some particular something that you will bring to the world, your community. In the Vodou traditions, when I interviewed Haitian and New Orleans Vodou practitioners, they talked about how if a spirit wanted to marry you, it was sometimes because you had something to bring to the house, right? You had a particular gift that with that loi, with that bonded marriage, you could bring that nobody else in that particular way could. And I think that this is really true for a lot of these marriages, particularly in my case and in the case of my mentor, Orion Foxwood, in the House of Brigh, Faery, Seership. There was a whole system of teaching and study and practice that came through his marriage, and his marriage in many ways fostered and guided my own, which this book is sort of the outcome of it. So R.J. Stewart, who is a Scottish fairy seer, likes to say that we do things that they can't, but they do things that we can't. And so together we can bring forth these really interesting co-creative projects that just on our own and our own sort of, even our creative or higher self consciousness, we might not be able to, might not be able to achieve alone. So there's a lovely symbiosis or a third consciousness that arises often from these these indwelled or these merged relationships.
So do you think that sort of third consciousness sort of arising out of that, and because I definitely want to get into sort of the aftermath of what happens after a spirit marriage, but do you think that sort of third energy that kind of flows through, is that not can that not also be gained through regular initiatory practices, for like speaking for initiatory traditions themselves, not just open traditions? Because I know when we hear the word like God spousing or spirit marriage, a lot of times you think of Hellenic or Nordic paths, right? You really don't hear it from like Asian paths or African ATR paths. Those concepts, we assume, we make the rash decision that's a Eurocentric idea. So those paths that are initiatory that we do see in the West and I'm sorry, not in the West, in the Caribbean and in Africa, is spirit marriage something that they can't already get through their own initiations for their practices?
I mean, you can't. I don't think you can speak for all of the Caribbean or all of Africa, right? What I can
Right.
tell you is that in West Africa, in Burkina Faso, the Dagara people practice spirit marriage, which they call merges, very readily. And there are a whole series of beings or spirits in their cosmology that are more what we would sort of classify as elemental type spirits. And so I'll just give you an example. I interviewed Madrone, who is a practitioner of the West African Dagara cosmology and tradition, and who was trained by Dr. Malindoma Some, who came from Burkina Faso, West Africa, and brought those teachings here to the U.S. And in their community, there are certain shrines that need to be set up to different spirits. So for different purposes to serve and facilitate within the community. And Madrone, is also married to an elder in that tradition. Her husband does divinatory work and other things. And he and Malindoma were sitting and talking about how they really needed to set up this one shrine called a Tingan shrine. And the Tingan is sort of a masculine energy of earth that oversees our foundations, our structure, and our finances, our abundance, our ability to be sustained. And before other shrines can be set up, the Tingan shrine has to be set up, and they needed and wanted to set up these other shrines. And so they were sort of scratching their chins, like who would be a good Tingan shrine keeper, because it requires that the human marry the spirit of Tingan and then tend their shrine. And so Malindoma was like, oh, it's your wife, it's Madrone. She is already in her professional life a financial planner and works with people with, their finances. And she is a very strong tree advocate. And one of the things with the Tingan shrine is that it manifests through or is placed at a tree.
Yeah, I remember reading that, and it seemed like a natural progression.
Mm-hmm. And so she, in that case, was asked by her elder to marry this spirit and to become the Tingan shrine keeper. And so she went through, and hers, in that tradition, there's a big ritual, and the whole community was there, and there were vows that were exchanged. And then now she has and this sort of the tree, which she had to go find a tree that would sort of be the proper host for this Tingan shrine energy. And she found this beautiful redwood tree up in the up in the mountains here in the Bay Area. And so she now goes to that shrine and has different community members come there, and they do different rituals and divination and different things at the tree with Tingan when people are having an issue in that particular area of their life. And that then opened the gates for other shrines to be set up. So in that very particular example, we're seeing an African tradition that is merging or marrying a human to otherworld. And I don't think that's unique to Burkina Faso. I think that because Malindoma was an academic and he brought it out in a really big way and has been really trying to bring the spiritual technologies of Burkina Faso, the Dagara land, to the West, we hear about it more. But I think that we know that transculturally this is a
From then
practice
on.
that happens around the world and from the
Yeah.
very beginnings of recorded history. And
So I was definitely like shocked to see, a couple of your interviews with Mambos in Haitian voodoo, and with a New Orleans voodoo sant as well. But I think the one that caught my eye is your exception to the rule, Miss Caroline's story. Because, and this is coming from someone who is only looking from the outside in. I found her story of marrying multiple spirits, which you yourself had even said, like in from what you've seen so far, that's like not a thing, for her to engage in all that, but specifically in traditions that are not known for stuff like that, such as Santeria and some of these other traditions. So I love that you labeled her the exception, but how does that, because it's hard to explain my train of thought with this one, and I hope you bear with me, but how is her story beneficial in the sense of, you know, going against the tradition, going against the grind, when you have very, very strict, like African technologies, very strict rules that are coming down from the spirits themselves, the elders. And then you have just this person outside of the culture that says, no, I want to marry and I'm gonna marry or whatever. I think it was she didn't have a choice in these particular cases. Um, how?
yeah, I mean,
Like,
it's a great question, and it really, I mean, one of the things that one of the ways that Caroline handled it was to not initiate into the traditions where she was being told that spirit marriage was not a thing or was not
yeah,
like,
she approached it, I believe, like solitarily. She
yeah,
decided, you know what, I'll interact with these energies on
yeah.
my own
And
then.
she is unique, and she's not unique in that she's married to multiple beings, because that the Haitians marry multiple loa, right? If you marry Erzuli Freda, you have to marry Erzuli Dantor because they balance each other out. So that's very common, to be married to more than one entity or spirit. What's a little transgressive about her is she's married from all these different, radically different pantheons.
Right.
So that's an interesting, but her story is all about being born and raised in Washington D.C., right, and having been married to a diplomat and being in this multicultural place and being taken as a young child to all of these different places, right, to Greece and to Britain and to all these different cultures, right, where she's experiencing all of these different deities, where she, and being a very highly sensitive, psychically sensitive person from a very young age, being able to hear the gods and the goddesses and the spirits that she's working with. So, I thought it was important to include her story because that, the other thing that she talks about is divorcing a spirit, right?
Mhm.
And I always think, especially as an academic and a researcher, you always want to look for the stories where they're talking about this is the tradition and this is how it happens and this is how we do it. And then you look for the outliers. You look for the people or the examples that say, this, I have a different experience, right? Because that
Right.
gives you the breadth. Like in some traditions, they say you can't ever divorce the spirit. Like Orion, I said, he could never divorce Brigh because that the nature of the Faery marriage that he went through was so arduous on his nervous system in the indwelling process that he's like, you could never pull the two of us apart. But in Caroline's case, it was a different, and as you said, in some of these cases, the spirits came and said, we're going to marry you now. And it wasn't really up for debate. And so she had a little, it was a little different of a attunement or an indwelling process than with Orion. And so she did have the ability to divorce. But then, some of the people that I spoke with said, you could never marry your divine self. You can't marry your higher or your divine self. But then I interviewed Kamadevi, right, the Shakta Tantric, and she's married to the goddess Kali, and Kali is also her Ishtadevi, or her patron goddess. And so And so it's interesting because then you have to start looking at it according to like, okay, this is how this tradition works. This is how this tradition works. This is how this tradition works. And you have to ask yourself, well, what is the cultural context that gives rise to these ideas? Like in the fairy tradition, it was for a very long time, it was always about marrying your opposite gender, right? You only marry your opposite gender because it balances polarity or something like that. But the minute that we start having the conversation of queer identity, non-binary, trans, then that whole like binary male or female, you just have to throw it out. And,
For sure.
you end up sort of with this question of, oh, maybe that teaching was just a product of its time, right? Maybe that belief was a product of its time, and that we only do it this way is essentially the prejudice, right? Or the lack of inclusivity
Right.
of the people that held that tradition. So you
Even
only,
the concept of marriage itself, I think what's such a mind fuck about this book is that, most people are going to pick it up and look at it from the Christian Western point of view of one man, one woman, this idea of having a relationship for the sake of procreation and for children. And so now you're being bombarded with, well, this concept of marriage isn't really that word. It's about a bond, and therefore you can have a bond with your higher self. You can have a bond with gods and spirits. And then this idea of gender, it's like, well, no, you can have a bond with people of the same gender. Then it's polyamory and this idea of you can have a bond with more than one spirit and not just the one. So it really just kind of like blows your mind as you're going through this book because you kind of tackle a little bit of everything in there. And I gotta give it to you because I'm not gonna lie, like I sat there and I grit my teeth in some parts because I was like, what? This is blasphemous. But then you kind of sit with it. You're like, but wait a second, that's because I'm approaching it from this lens that I need to remove right now and kind of look at it differently.
yeah.
And you definitely helped me do that. Yeah, for sure. And another piece of it too is this idea of like your responsibility to it all.
Yeah.
You as the initiate, you have a spirit or multiple spirits or spirits of the same gender, whatever, come to you and say, you have a purpose. I see something within you that I connect with and I want it to manifest in the world. And therefore, you and I need to be bonded. What the fuck? Like, okay, then what? Then what happens? Like, what's your responsibility as that initiate? What is your role? And how does it then impact the rest of your work and even your real life relationships?
Yeah, yeah. So, well, let me back up really quickly before I started coughing there, had my little
Mhm.
coffee fit. So I approach the research through the lens of decolonization, right? Decolonization, feminist and queer spirituality, and scholarship. And what you're talking about, like the lens, it's the lens that most of us that have grown up here in the West suffer under, right? We suffer under this very dominant Christian narrative, right? That says, the universe, the world, society should function this particular way, and it's a narrative that benefits a very small group of people by and large, right? But you step outside of our Western construct and you see that the world works very differently in other cultures and
Yeah.
other worldviews. And spirit marriage is, I think, a great example of how humans have devotional relationships with an animism or an animist view of the world
Yes.
outside of just this very narrowly defined monotheistic or Western lens. And so it and the irony is, right, that these stories of spirit marriage are very, like, I like to say, they're hidden in plain sight, right? They're throughout all of our Western, like even Christianity, right? The virgin birth is a great example of a type of spirit marriage or spiritual intimacy.
Yep.
So to the question about like, okay, so the spirits are wanting to deepen in your relationship with them. Maybe you've had a familiar spirit that has been around for a while and they're wanting to deepen that relationship. The first thing that I really recommend is that people get support, right? They find a tradition or a mentor or an elder or a community, right, that will help them discern, right? Because that understanding what the spirit is asking and why they're asking it and what the agenda is of the relationship and what you're agreeing to, right? That's all part of the discernment process that you need to learn how to go through, whether that is through cultivating like divinatory tools where you're learning to divine and discern the voice of the spirit. I mean, in my case, I reached out to my who would become my mentor, Orion Foxwood, and initiated and began to apprentice, I should say, not initiate, but apprentice to his tradition, because he doesn't use the term initiation in his tradition. So like he became one of my main go-to support people because he already held a spirit marriage, and the spirit that was reaching out to me was sort of similar to his Faery Seership tradition. But the other thing is I had a really kick-ass transpersonal psychotherapist that I was working with. And this was somebody who was trained in earth-based spirituality. So she wasn't gonna like immediately dismiss these extraordinary experiences that I was having and take them seriously and help me discern. But like a big piece of the discernment process is just like learning what is me? What is my lens? What are all these various inputs that I have from my epigenetic ancestral inputs to the culture that I was raised in, to if I was raised in a religion or not, to, you know, my circles of influence, media, family, friends, all of that. Like those are all voices, right, that we contend with, right? And then we have our own inner aspects, right? Our child self, our rebel self, all these different potential parts of us that are at play. And then you add in the voices of the spirits on top of that, right? And got like a lot going on potentially that you have to sort of psycho-spiritually learn how to discern through. So it's a process of devoting yourself, right? And I talk about this in the book, right? Devoting yourself to the relationship. And again, it's an advanced practice in that you've kind of gone through the dating process and you've gotten to the point where you're interested in deepening with a particular spirit or spirits, right? And so you are then, just like you would with a human relationship, you're wanting to sort of vet them and get really clear about what your relationship agreements are going to be, set your boundaries, you know, have good boundaries. And that's sort of the devotional practice, right? The devotion to the relationship, just like you would to like a human person that you've fallen in love with and you want to deepen that relationship, right?
You know, I kind of hearken it to, you know, the Christian nuns who, you know, pretty much are quote unquote married to Jesus. They're the wives of Jesus. And it's this idea. I have a beautiful friend. I won't name any names and I won't name any traditions that she's in, but I have a beautiful friend who went through a spirit marriage. And her experience was with two spirits in particular, and so she was married into to both of them, and she almost became like after that marriage, she almost became like a nun of that particular tradition, and she became like the keeper of all of their shrines, and I mean like to the point where she almost cut off all access to like regular real world stuff. She only kept like a handful of friends who understood what she was going through. And that was really it. Like she woke up, went to work, came home, devotion of the gods. Devotion of the gods, go to sleep, get up, go to work, come back, devotion of the gods. Just like that was her life. And I'm wondering, is it that intense for everyone, or does that it depends on the person and the tradition.
It depends on the person, the tradition, the deities or the beings that you're, involved with. And I mean, a whole host of things, your own natural relationship style and relationship inclination. Um, it just really varies from person to person. I mean, if you think about it, Leilani, these are practices that we have been part of our human experience and experiment, for hundreds, if not thousands of years. And, the first textual records of this that I found, and there may be older ones, but I didn't come across them, are in the Sumerian sacred marriage, right? The ancient Mesopotamian sacred marriage of the goddess Ishtar to her priests and priestesses, and they would marry her, and then they would be the temple keeper. And this isn't just unique to Mesopotamia. You see this in Egypt and Greece, where there is a shrine or a temple to the deity, and the priests and priestesses. I mean, this is still practiced in India, right? In parts of India. And devotional work practices in India, where the priests or the priestesses live there, and their job is to feed and tend the deity and to facilitate worship of that deity by the community. And so that can be, and certainly the monastic nuns are a great example of this, right? It can be a monastic relationship. And certainly in Kamadevi's story, the Shakta Tantric, that was, the case for her. She lives a semi-reclusive lifestyle. She facilitates sadhana or spiritual practice for her tantric community, but she's married to the goddess Kali, and she likes to say, Kali is sort of a one person deity, and she doesn't really have room nor much of a desire for other kinds of relationships in her life. But she's also a spiritual teacher, and that is often, the byproduct of some of the more intense indwelling agreements with powerful deity, is that you often become a spiritual practitioner for a community within that tradition.
Yes.
But that's not, I would say maybe that is, at least according to the people that I interviewed, that's more of the exception and not the rule, because almost everybody else that I interviewed with had a human partner, had their regular life. They maybe taught or wrote or served. I mean, these practices, depending on the community, I mean, it's very common within the Vodou traditions to marry the Loa, to marry the spirits. And so it doesn't necessarily change much of your day-to-day life. You have more of like a being that is a protector and a confidant, and many people in those traditions marry the spirits.
So again, and I just want to remind everyone in the chat, it's about a bond. It's not necessarily the traditional way we look at marriage, right? So like, I know in, for example, Santeria, it's not a marriage, it's more like a parent to a child kind of situation.
Yeah.
I'm unfamiliar with voodoo, like that is not my forte, but I'm curious, is that also the situation? It's the spirits are sort of protectors and crowners as well, or are we looking at an actual like relationship marriage, like peer to peer?
It really just depends, right? Like, just we have many people that we have different types of relationships with. Sometimes we have familiar spirits or protector deities. Sometimes we have guiding spirits or tutelary deities, or beings, I should say, not because I'm not just necessarily a deity. Sometimes we have in the Vodou tradition, they have the mariage loa, which is the marriage to a spirit or a loa, and that I would say is like seasoning. So that's sort of this external being that's external to you that you would marry for the purpose of the spirit marriage. But you also have a matet, and the matet is like your patron deity, or like a parental type figure, or even you could look at it as an aspect of your own divine self that you are an expression of, that you're flowing through that energy into the house. And so that's that is present within the tantric traditions, right? I talked about the Ishta Devi or Ishta Devata, the chosen deity that is like your patron deity. It's present in the ceremonial traditions where you talk about the holy guardian angel or the angel of the being. And this is generally understood to be not quite the same thing as a higher self, but like a step above that, like the deity, the divine archetype that you are here to be an expression of. And those and that's sort of the territory where I was sort of told, well, you wouldn't marry your angel, right? You wouldn't marry your divine self. But then here we have Kama Devi, who is married to Kali, and Kali is also her Ishta Devi. So it just depends on the nature of the relationship. I am not an initiate, nor have I studied much of the Santeria Regla Ocha tradition. But I do know that spirit marriage is not necessarily a part of how how that functions within that community, although the spirits in that community, at least in Carolyn's case, had wanted to marry her for various reasons. But as we talked about earlier, so I think that if you're working within a tradition and you're wanting to uphold that tradition and preserve that tradition and make sure that the teachings and the practices last, like if that's your karma, if that's your calling in life, then you want to work within that to preserve, right? To preserve the tradition. But there's also traditions can evolve and morph, and they can combine with other things. I mean, this is pantheism, pantheistic practice, right? And we see that even Christianity has its roots in Mithraism and in some various forms of Hellenic spirituality that was going on in the Mesopotamian or the middle Mediterranean. Thank you, Megan. The Mediterranean area at that time. So I think that I think we need both, right? We need evolution of religion and spiritual practice, and we also need like the folks that are holding the traditions. So that we have a preservation of technique. And so you might not be doing both of those, right, in this lifetime. You might be doing one or the other of those. But
and I think that's really important. I think it's important that evolution as well to also be facilitated by the people of those cultures, right? So that's why I had asked you earlier about that with regards to those quote unquote closed practices or those practices that are initiatory. It's important that if evolution is to occur, it's to occur with their blessings, to allow that to happen. Because again, it's all like divine creation. Like you've seen it where it talks about how like the spirit comes down and says, I want to marry you. It's the same thing as the spirit comes down to the elders and says, this is what this year is going to be about, or this is what, the theme for this particular house is going to be doing, or whatever. And I feel like that evolution is also part of that information that's coming down through the right channels and the right chains of that tradition. One thing that I saw in your book that I loved so much was this concept that a lot of times people approach spirit marriage and having issues with their own personal sexuality, right? With their own issues with their body and how they feel in their body, and that spirit marriage has helped them heal. I'm curious though, what is the role of sexuality in this practice? Like, are you having sex with a spirit? You know what I mean? And with that said, we talk about things like, incubuses and succubuses and spirits that are lustful and things like that. Like, is that the same concept that we're talking about here, or is it a different type of intimacy, a different type of um sexuality between the person and the spirit?
again, it just goes back to the individual, right? Like what do you consider sex, right? How do you define eroticism? What's the nature of how you orient in your own sexuality, in your own gender identity and erotic, pleasure centers, right? What turns me on isn't going to be what turns somebody else on.
Right.
But so there's that sort of piece. A lot of it just has to do with your own personal orientation and preferences. And then, like, not everybody that I interviewed that's in a spirit marriage has erotic experiences with their spirit beloved. And some folks look through the lens more of the what we would define as like sex or eroticism as being more of like a vitality that arises, like the rising in the body. And so it's and from that perspective, it's not that the spirits are necessarily trying to have sex with us. It's that when we interface with those energies, right? And again, we're talking through the lens of benevolent spirit marriage, love and trust and want to be.
You like, vetted already.
Vetted them already, right? That encounter often, because that they're not bound in, and I don't mean bound as like a bad thing, like the human form, like I said, we do some pretty awesome things or can do some pretty awesome things being in a body, but they're not. And so their vibratory rate, they're like, we live in this 3-dimensional time-space reality. They do not. And right. So when we interface with that kind of a vastness that is unbound by a human form, it can very easily set off all of our bells and whistles, and our nervous system often interprets it as eroticism because everything sort of goes into like hallelujah, exaltation,
orgasmic state.
Yeah. But if we even step back for a moment and understand like the sacred sex through the lens of sacred sexuality, right? What is going on in orgasm? What is going on in intentional sexual contact, even between two humans? It's a powerful transmission that can happen. And right in the sacred sexuality, particularly in a lot of the tantric practices, that and the Taoist healing love practices, that vitality, that eroticism is used for longevity, for transformation of consciousness, for healing, for all sorts of different things. So even just amongst humans, and then you add in this sort of numinous aspect of the otherworldly, and as Caroline talks about in her story, she experiences sex with the spirits as a kind of healing. She's had a lot of health issues that she's had to deal with over the years, and she's found that when the spirits interact with her in that way, it's because that there's a kind of either activation, transmission, or healing that needs to happen in her nervous system. And that's certainly been my experience as well. But to just focus on it as, oh, it's just this means for sort of an imaginal sexual encounter, I think is sort of missing the fuller picture of what these relationships can be like. And I didn't focus, my research on the deleterious or the more sort of dangerous spirits like incubi, succubi, or spirits that we don't know, like, and trust, right? We know happens. We know that those are out there. One of the first things that I did when I was starting to have these encounters was to get my butt into an initiatory tradition that would teach me how to protect and grid and guard myself, and then to step in a really deep devotional relationship with an individual deity that became my gatekeeper. Right, that became the sort of bouncer, and that deity I knew, I liked, I trusted, I felt good in my relationship with her, and I was like, if you want me to work with beings other than you bring them to me, you introduce me to them, you let me know that is what I'm going to be doing. Otherwise, I'm just talking with you right now, because I was like, I was like lit up like a Christmas tree. I was like open for business, and I was having all these spirit encounters, and I was like, okay, we gotta like narrow this down here a little bit so that I can do this in a safe and sane kind of way.
Right. You brought up Mary and like this idea of spirit birth. Is that a thing? Like, can you have spirit offspring? And what is that? Like, is that what we call the indigo kids today, the crystal children today? Are these the kinds of energies we're bringing into the earth now? Or is it more about spirit offspring in the spirit realm?
I think it's a both and, honestly. I mean, anthropologically and folklorically, you see it's kind of a both and, right?
Yeah.
And you know, in my book, probably the first third of the book is just about these anthropological, historical, religious, esoteric accounts, and I kind of trace them throughout history. I by no means covered all of them because that was just way too big of um, a project to try and cover every single instance of it. I tried to give you sort of like the high level examples transculturally. Um, and one of the first sort of academic-y kind of examples that we know about is Mircea Eliade's research on the Siberian shamans, right? And the one of the interviews that he did was a Siberian shamanic practitioner who was married to a spirit, his ayami. In that culture, that's the name of the spirit spouse. And they had a whole spirit children, right, in the astral, in the other world that they had given birth to.
Mm.
But like, if you just look at the stories of like the Greeks, right, they're perfect examples of the demigods, you know, being these offspring between a human and a deity.
Yeah.
And it's not unique to them either. Like, you look at the Christian account in Genesis of the sons of God and the daughters of men and giving birth
Science.
to Nephilim and the giants.
Yeah.
And you see that same story over and over and over again. You see it in the folkloric fairy account, even more recently in the folkloric fairy accounts, where Dion Fortune, who is a well-known early 20th century esotericist and occultist, talks about meeting somebody who was like a fairy human hybrid, and describes, you know, the way that, you know, so she sort of knew that because that they looked a certain way and behaved a certain way. And she gives a few accounts of that.
Yeah,
But
and you
so,
also can look at a lot of the ancestral spirits who have ascended to sort of like these godlike statuses. They were still once human who had bloodlines and lineages, but who they themselves are ascended.
yeah.
Um, so they're looked at almost like gods, but they're actually ancestral spirits with actual bloodlines.
Well, and there's an argument, you know, in the academic world, we call it euhemerism. And it's this idea that all deities were once
Once
human.
human. Yep, I've heard that. Yep.
And that over time, you know, they either were humans with exceptional abilities or humans who maybe had some remarkable qualities, and they became sort of embellished over time and elevated to these, you know, signs and wonders. But I mean, one of the byproducts, going back to the question that you asked a little earlier about why do this, one of the most common byproducts of the spirit marriage that's reported again and again is the evolution of the human's consciousness and the
Mm,
activation of extrasensory capabilities, right?
yes.
So we have our mundane five senses and our extra senses when we step into these bonded relationships, because that we're now walking with, right? A being that is maybe merged or indwelled or integral in our consciousness. Our consciousness becomes sort of something beyond just the human, and we have access to information and experiences and senses and things beyond just the regular five senses that you know, most Homo sapiens sort of walk around with. And I love.
I can definitely sort of attest to that. The woman that I had mentioned earlier, who I said is my friend and had that spirit marriage with those two spirits, she too, you know, once it all happened, the the her energy shifted entirely to the point where like when she walked in the room, it was a tangible feel. You could feel the temperature, the energy, and everything in the room shift. Because
Mhm.
and she would walk in and you would see a god. You would see sort of like the light around her as she walked into the room, and you're like, "That's not a person." And
Mhm.
so I'm wondering if this spirit bond, if this spirit marriage, it's 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 much it's much more than channeling. It's a but at the same time, it's not quite possession. It's sort of like housing housing a spirit in a way,
Well,
right?
I mean, I think everybody. regulates it slightly differently, right?
Okay.
Because like Orion talks about how when he closes his eyes, he sees into his fairy wife Brigh's world. But when he opens his eyes, she sees into his world. So
Ooh.
there is this mingled and merged and a symbiosis between the two consciousnesses. But he also says there are times where she recedes into her world because she needs to do certain things that he doesn't need to be a part of, and the times where he's in his very human world doing things that she doesn't necessarily need to be part of. But it's like, unlike a lot of channeling and mediumship where there's a certain practice and protocol and the spirit comes in and the spirit goes out and there's this sort of delineated, and maybe they leave a little bit of their spark or their blessedness, but there's an in and then there's an out, right? It's bookended experience. The indwelling or the merged or the marriage is more of this co-walking or this co-mingling of the two consciousnesses.
It's a full integration.
Yeah, not to the point where they're dominating your consciousness, right? But where you've negotiated, right? And the boundaries between you and them may become a little more fluid, but that's also where it's really important leading, into that kind of a dynamic that we have really good agreements and boundaries around, what am I getting into? Why am I doing this? What's the purpose of this? What's the outcome going to be?
Exactly.
To the best of my, ability to understand that.
To my chat room people, we are coming towards the end of this live, and both Dr. Megan Rose and myself have a little surprise for you guys. We want a special viewer tonight to get a free copy of this amazing book. And I mean, all you really had to do was just participate, comment, say hello, maybe share. Maybe Dr. Megan Rose has a little question or something you might need to answer. But all in all, it's a very simple process to get to this book. Dr. Megan, will you choose someone or will you find a way to choose someone?
Well, I'm looking here, and what I would love to do is, I'm just now seeing that, there's this whole other thing with comments and chat. I was just saying the private chat and I was like, well, nobody's saying anything. So here is a question. First person to answer this question. And we've said this like a million times throughout this interview, so you don't have to have read my book. Give me one other term for spirit marriage.
Woo! That's a good one. What's another term for spirit
like
marriage?
3 or 4 of the different terms that they could possibly be. So like first person to put in the chat just one of the other things that and I'll hint, it's the title of one of them is the title of this talk today.
I already put the book down.
Yeah. So,
and I didn't post the title.
Yay, Merrick Rosenberg.
Merrick
Holzonsky.
Congratulations, Merrick. Make sure you message me your email address and your house address so that I can send you over your copy.
Yeah. Yay. So yeah, they were God spousing, indwelling, merge, and symbiosis. Those are some of the other terms that are used for this.
Beautiful. Dr. Rose, is there anything? So let's say, I had mentioned earlier in the live that, this is a really hot button topic. A lot of, especially younger people who are exploring their spirituality, who are, exploring different deities and spirits, and who are possibly exploring the idea of spirit marriage. What would be some advice or some information you'd want to give to those youthful people or anyone who might be exploring this subject, this idea?
Yeah. Well, it is a marathon, not a sprint. Take your time, get to know them, develop the trust, right? Develop the ability to discern their touch or their voice. The visuals, how they show it visually is less important and less accurate than the somatic or the felt sense experience that you have, because many of these beings have multiple forms that they could show up like, from anthropocentric to other, like color or vibration or whatever. So it's more important. At least my teachers have imparted the importance of what it feels like, taking your time, really getting to learn and know them, having to support people around you, whether it's an elder in a tradition or a therapist or a coach or somebody that understands this work, that respects this work, and that can really help you do some of that internal discerning process of, what is their voice and what are they telling me versus what is great Aunt Sally's ancestral voice that might be talking to me. And, to that end, I do offer courses and groups and stuff to support people in this. If you have a tradition that's calling to you because that the being or the entity is like known within a tradition, then you can work within that tradition and usually find a really great support system there. I've sort of oriented what I do to people who are not in a particular tradition or sort of in a cross pantheon, or maybe not even, working with a spirit that even has a kind of pantheon. I work with people who have a lot of relationships with ancestral and beloved dead. And so, you can go to my website, Dr. Megan Rose, and learn more about that. And you can also go to the book website, spiritmarriage.com, and share your experiences. I have a form there where you can sort of share your stories with me, because I'm still, like I said, the research, it's ongoing. I'm still learning more and more accounts from different traditions. Like I recently just learned about the Polynesian tradition, and that a whole series of spiritual practitioners have been married to the goddess Pele
Wow.
in the Hawaiian Polynesian tradition. So, and they date their ancestry back to this marriage to the spirit. And in China, the marriage to the fox spirits in China, the fox fairy spirits in China, is something that I also recently learned about. So it's, I'm constantly collecting more and more information on this, because it's something that I'm, passionate
Yes.
about. So
Oh my gosh. Well, I appreciate your work so much. And now, am I allowed to ask, like, are you hopefully coming out with like a part 2, part 3? Like, is this going to be like a series of stuff that we should be looking forward to? Can I ask that?
um,
Maybe.
originally my publisher wanted me to split it into 2 or 3 books, and I was like, that's
Do it.
not, it's no, well, that's why the book is 450 pages. Because I was like, this needs to all come out together, because that it gives, we talk about the past, and then we talk about the present, which is all the contemporary stories, and then we talk about the future and practices. And I felt like that all needed to come out together. What
Yeah.
I am looking at doing with a colleague of mine who's a clinical sexologist is actually doing a research study on spiritual intimacy. So more of the erotic aspect of this. And
Yes.
so I think that's probably what's next on the horizon, and that'll give rise to probably some articles, and maybe she and I will co-author. They and I will co-author a book together. We'll
Yes.
see.
Oh my God. I hope so. I really hope so. Dr. Rose, thank you so much for hanging out with us tonight, and all the people who showed up in the live, and all those who are going to be rewatching it on the replay. This subject is never ending. By all means, this is a great place to start, and then just keep going with it. I hope everyone has a wonderful, wonderful Sunday night. And don't forget, this is how we grow. Have a good night, everybody.
Good night. Thank you.